The thermometer outside Lars Eriksson's cabin read -32 degrees on that January morning in 1839. Yet inside his earth-sheltered dwelling, the temperature held steady at 43 degrees, with only embers glowing in his small fireplace. 300 yards away, Thomas Caldwell fed log after log into a roaring fire just to keep his traditional cabin above freezing, burning through a week's worth of firewood in a single night, while Lars used less wood in a month than most trappers burned in 3 days. Before we dive into how one Norwegian trapper's impossible idea changed frontier survival forever, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten innovation move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an engineering secret that saved dozens of lives. The winter of 1838 arrived early in the Montana Territory. By mid-November, temperatures had already dropped below zero, and experienced trappers knew they were facing one of the harshest seasons in memory. Lars Eriksson and his partner, Henrik Olofsson, had built their cabin the previous spring, following every standard practice they had learned from other mountain men. The structure stood in a clearing near a creek, positioned for easy access to water and trap lines. The walls were solid pine logs, carefully notched at corners and chinked with moss and clay. The roof was layered bark over pole rafters, covered with sod for insulation. By frontier standards, it was well built and adequate. But adequate was not enough. The cabin leaked heat like a sieve. Every gap between logs, every imperfection in the chinking, every draft around the door allowed precious warmth to escape into the frozen air. The men kept a fire burning constantly, feeding it throughout the night in shifts. They consumed firewood at an alarming rate. A single cold night required a full day's worth of wood cutting to replenish their supply. The mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. They spent more time gathering fuel than trapping beaver. Lars had grown up in Norway, in a coastal village where winter meant months of darkness and cold that penetrated to the bone. His family had been poor, but they had survived using techniques passed down through generations. Root cellars dug into hillsides stayed cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. Stone houses with thick walls held heat far better than wooden structures. His father had worked in copper mines where the tunnels maintained steady temperatures regardless of surface conditions. These memories nagged at Lars as he watched smoke pour from their cabin chimney, carrying heat into the sky. Henrik was less troubled by the inefficiency. He was younger, stronger, and viewed woodcutting as simply part of mountain life. He had come west from Pennsylvania 3 years earlier and had survived previous winters using the same methods. When Lars mentioned his concerns about their fuel consumption, Henrik shrugged and suggested they just cut more wood. There was no shortage of trees. The solution seemed obvious to him. But Lars saw deeper problems. Their trap lines extended miles from the cabin. Time spent cutting wood was time not spent checking traps, processing pelts, or hunting for meat. The constant labor was exhausting them both. More concerning was the danger of injury or illness. If one of them became unable to work, maintaining the fire would become impossible for a single man. They would freeze while surrounded by forest. The cold deepened as December arrived. Temperatures dropped to 10 below, then 20 below, then lower still. The men burned through their woodpile faster than they could replenish it. December 20th arrived with clear skies and plummeting temperatures. The thermometer Lars had brought from St. Louis registered -26 degrees at dawn. Inside the cabin, even with the fire roaring, frost formed on the interior walls wherever chinking had failed. The men wore every piece of clothing they owned and still shivered. Henrik had developed a persistent cough over the previous week, a deep rattling sound that worried Lars, but which Henrik dismissed as nothing serious. They had depleted their nearby firewood supply. The closest standing deadwood now required a half-mile walk through deep snow. Henrik volunteered to make the trip, while Lars stayed to maintain the fire and prepare their evening meal. It was a routine division of labor they had performed dozens of times. Henrik bundled himself in his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and headed into the forest with his axe and rope for dragging logs. Lars expected him back within 2 hours. When 3 hours passed with no sign of his partner, concern began to build. When 4 hours had elapsed, Lars knew something was wrong. He banked the fire carefully, dressed in his warmest gear, and followed Henrik's trail into the darkening forest. The tracks were easy to follow in the snow, leading northwest toward a stand of dead pines they had identified earlier in the week. He found Henrik a mile from the cabin, collapsed in the snow beside a pile of cut wood. His partner was still breathing but unconscious, his face pale and his body shaking with violent tremors. Lars immediately recognized the signs of severe hypothermia. Henrik had apparently overexerted himself, cutting wood, soaking his clothes with sweat. In the extreme cold, that moisture had turned his garments into frozen shells that drew heat from his body faster than he could generate it. Lars tried to wake him, but Henrik remained unresponsive. Carrying a full-grown man through a mile of deep snow was nearly impossible, but Lars had no choice. He fashioned a crude sling from rope, positioned Henrik on his back, and began the agonizing journey back to the cabin. The effort required every ounce of strength he possessed. He fell multiple times, struggled to his feet, and continued. The return journey took nearly 3 hours. By the time Lars got Henrik inside and positioned near the fire, his partner's breathing had become shallow and irregular. Lars removed the frozen clothing, wrapped Henrik in every blanket they owned, and tried to warm him gradually. He had seen hypothermia before and knew that warming too quickly could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He held warm water to Henrik's lips, trying to get him to drink. Nothing helped. Henrik Olafsson died 2 hours before dawn on December 21, 1838. He never regained consciousness. Lars sat beside his partner's body as morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, understanding with absolute clarity that their shelter, their methods, their entire approach to surviving mountain winters was fundamentally inadequate. Lars buried Henrik 3 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together. The ground was frozen solid, forcing him to build a cairn of stones instead of digging a grave. He marked the spot with a cross made from pine branches and spoke a prayer in Norwegian that his mother had taught him as a child. Then he returned to the cabin alone, facing a winter that had months remaining and a solitude that pressed against him like physical weight. The cabin felt different without Henrik's presence. Larger somehow and colder despite the fire. Lars maintained his trap lines mechanically, checking sets and processing pelts with the efficiency of long practice. But his mind was elsewhere. He kept returning to the fundamental question that Henrik's death had made urgent and unavoidable. Why did shelters that seemed adequate still allow men to freeze? What was wrong with the basic design that every trapper used? He thought about his childhood in Norway, specifically about his older brother Nils, who had died during a winter storm when Lars was 12. Nils had been caught away from home when a blizzard struck, seeking shelter in a shepherd's hut that stood in high pasture. The hut was similar in construction to the cabin Lars now occupied. Wooden walls, simple roof, small fireplace. Nils had fuel and matches. He should have survived. But when the storm cleared 3 days later, they found him frozen, his fire long dead, his fuel exhausted. That death had haunted Lars's father for years. The old man had become obsessed with understanding why structures failed to protect people. He studied traditional Norwegian building methods, particularly the old turf houses that had sheltered families for generations before wooden construction became common. These ancient dwellings were partially underground, their walls thick earth and stone, their roofs heavy sod supported by timber frames. They required minimal heating even in the harshest winters. Lars remembered visiting his grandmother's turf house as a young child. The structure was built into a hillside, with only the front wall fully exposed. Inside, the temperature remained remarkably stable. In summer, it stayed cool. In winter, it never dropped to freezing, even when the exterior fire pit was unlit for days. His grandmother had explained that the earth itself held warmth, that once heated by even a small fire, the soil and stone surrounding the living space released that warmth slowly throughout the day and night. His father had worked in the Røros copper mines, deep shafts driven into Norwegian mountains where miners extracted ore year-round. The mine tunnels maintained constant temperature regardless of surface weather. In winter, descending into the mines meant entering relative warmth. In summer, the tunnels provided cool refuge from heat above. His father had explained the principle of ground temperature, how the earth below a certain depth stayed at consistent temperature, insulated from the wild fluctuations of air and weather. These memories crystallized into a single realization as Lars sat in his cabin, feeding wood into a fire that heated air which immediately escaped through 100 gaps and cracks. He was fighting the wrong battle. Everyone was fighting the wrong battle. The spring rendezvous of 1839 brought trappers from across the territory to a trading post on the Yellowstone River. Men gathered to sell their winter's catch, resupply, exchange information, and enjoy brief human company before returning to isolation. Lars attended, selling his and Henrik's combined pelts for a respectable sum, but his purpose extended beyond commerce. He needed to test his idea against the skepticism of experienced men. The gathering included roughly 30 trappers, most of them veterans of multiple mountain winters. They sat around evening fires, sharing whiskey and stories, comparing trap designs, and discussing which valleys still held good beaver populations. Lars listened for a while, then broached his idea carefully. He described Henrik's death, explained his observations about heat loss in standard cabins, and proposed a different approach to shelter construction. Instead of building above ground, he suggested excavating into hillsides and creating partially underground dwellings that would use earth itself as insulation. The response was immediate and dismissive. Thomas Caldwell, a Kentucky trapper with 10 years in the mountains, laughed outright at the proposal. He pointed out that bears denned in hillsides and asked if Lars wanted to move in with them. Others joined the mockery. Building underground was building your own grave, they said. Everyone knew that hillside dwellings flooded with rain and collapsed from earth weight. The idea was ridiculous, dangerous, and ignored generations of proven cabin-building wisdom. Samuel Garrett, an older trapper originally from Virginia, asked more thoughtful questions. How would Lars prevent water infiltration? How would he support the weight of earth on a roof? How would he ventilate smoke from a fire? These were legitimate engineering challenges, and Lars admitted he did not yet have complete answers. He knew the principle was sound based on Norwegian tradition and his father's mining experience, but translating that knowledge into frontier practice required solving specific technical problems. Johann Weber, a German immigrant who had trapped for 6 years, listened without comment. After the others had exhausted their ridicule, he asked Lars a single question. How much firewood did Lars think such a dwelling would require compared to a standard cabin? Lars estimated perhaps 1/5 as much, possibly less. Johann nodded slowly but said nothing more that evening. The mockery continued over the next 2 days. Whenever Lars appeared, someone made a joke about his plan to live like a badger or asked if he had started digging yet. Peter Morrison, a Scottish trapper, suggested Lars was suffering from mountain fever that affected judgment. The consensus was clear. Lars Eriksson had lost his mind to grief and was proposing something that violated common sense and practical experience. But Lars was undeterred. He had seen too many men die from cold, had burned too much wood for too little warmth, had watched Henrik freeze despite having shelter and fuel. The mockery only strengthened his resolve to prove the principle sound. Lars returned to his trapping territory in late May with specific criteria for his building site. He spent 2 weeks surveying hillsides within reasonable distance of good beaver streams, evaluating each location against requirements he had developed during long winter nights of planning. The site needed southern exposure to maximize sunlight on the dwelling's facade during winter months. It needed stable soil or rock substrate that would not shift or collapse. It needed elevation above potential flood zones. And it needed a slope angle steep enough to allow excavation, but not so severe that earth pressure would be unmanageable. He found the ideal location on a ridge overlooking a tributary of the Yellowstone. The hillside faced almost due south, angled at roughly 30 degrees. When he dug test holes with his shovel, he discovered the soil extended only 2 feet before hitting solid rock layer. This was perfect. The rock would serve as the rear and side walls of his dwelling, providing thermal mass that would absorb and release heat. The stability of bedrock eliminated concerns about collapse. Thomas Caldwell and 2 other trappers passed through the area in early June and found Lars marking out his excavation site with stakes and cord. They stopped to watch, curious, despite their skepticism. Lars explained his selection criteria, describing how the rock layer would provide structural support and thermal stability. He outlined his plan to dig back 15 feet into the hillside, creating a chamber that would be surrounded on 3 sides by earth and stone. Caldwell shook his head in disbelief. He pointed out that digging 15 feet into rock and soil would require months of backbreaking labor. A standard cabin could be built in days. Why would anyone choose to work 10 times harder for a dwelling that would probably flood or collapse? Lars responded calmly that he would rather work hard once and survive comfortably than build quickly and freeze. The exchange was civil but revealed the fundamental divide in thinking. Caldwell valued speed and conventional methods. Lars valued physics and thermal efficiency. The other trappers departed, convinced they would return in autumn to find Lars's project abandoned after he realized the futility of his efforts. But Lars began excavation the next morning. He had basic tools: a pickaxe, a shovel, a pry bar, and a sledgehammer. The work was exactly as difficult as everyone predicted. The soil near the surface moved relatively easily, but once he reached bedrock, progress slowed dramatically. He swung the pickaxe hour after hour, breaking rock into fragments he could pry loose and carry out of the growing cavity. His hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His shoulders and back ached constantly. Some days he managed only a few inches of progress. But the chamber slowly took shape, extending back into the hillside at steady if glacial pace. He worked from dawn until the light failed, then collapsed in a temporary shelter he had constructed nearby. Each morning he returned to the excavation and continued, driven by the memory of Henrik's frozen body and the certainty that conventional shelters were death traps dressed as adequate protection. By mid-July, Lars had excavated a chamber 8 feet deep into the hillside. The work had consumed 6 weeks of continuous effort. His food supplies were running low, forcing him to split time between excavation and hunting. He shot a deer and spent 2 days processing the meat, smoking strips over a low fire to preserve them. He checked a few beaver sets he had maintained, more to vary his diet than for the pelts. But excavation remained his primary focus. The chamber dimensions were taking precise shape in his mind as he worked. 15 feet deep, 12 feet wide, 8 feet high at the center. Large enough to live and work comfortably, small enough to heat efficiently. The rear wall was solid bedrock, exposed by his excavation and remarkably smooth. The side walls transitioned from rock at the back to compacted soil toward the front. He shaped these walls carefully, creating surfaces as vertical and even as possible using tools designed for different purposes. Other trappers occasionally passed by and stopped to observe. Most shook their heads and moved on without comment. A few offered unsolicited advice about why the project would fail. Johann Weber visited in late July and spent an hour examining Lars's work without speaking. Finally, he asked about Lars's plans for the roof structure. Lars described his intention to use heavy timbers spanning the width of the chamber, supported at the front by the log facade wall and at the rear by the bedrock. Weber listened, nodded, and departed. Lars could not tell if the German trapper was impressed or simply cataloging details of an interesting failure in progress. The physical toll of excavation was substantial. Lars had always been strong from years of frontier life, but this work demanded strength of a different order. Swinging a pickaxe against solid rock for 8 hours daily built muscle while grinding down the body. He lost weight despite eating everything he could hunt or gather. His clothes hung loose. He developed a persistent cough from rock dust that filled the excavation cavity each day. But he continued. By August, He had reached his target depth of 15 feet. The chamber extended back into the hillside like a horizontal mine shaft, surrounded by millions of pounds of earth and stone. The interior was dark except for the opening at the front, cool even during hot summer days, and completely dry. No water seeped through the rock walls, no soil crumbled from the ceiling. The stability exceeded his expectations. He stood inside the completed excavation on an August evening, holding a lantern and examining his work. The space felt substantial and permanent. The rock walls radiated coolness they had absorbed from deep earth. The air was still and quiet, insulated from wind and weather. For the first time since beginning this project, Lars allowed himself to believe fully that his idea would work. The earth surrounding him represented thermal mass beyond anything a wooden cabin could provide. Once heated by even a modest fire, these tons of rock and soil would hold and release warmth for hours. Lars began interior work in mid-August, transforming the raw excavation into a livable space. The first task involved leveling the floor. His digging had left an uneven surface of broken rock and compacted soil. He spent a week removing high spots, filling low areas, and creating a floor that sloped slightly toward the entrance for drainage. He covered this base with a layer of gravel he hauled from the creek, then topped the gravel with flat stones fitted together like crude paving. The result was a floor that would shed water if any entered and provide a stable surface for furniture and daily life. The rock rear wall required minimal work. Nature had provided a surface smoother than Lars could have shaped himself. He cleaned it thoroughly, removing loose fragments and dust. The wall showed layers of sedimentary stone, light gray and dark gray bands that revealed the geological history of this hillside. Lars traced these layers with his fingers, thinking about the thousands of years required to form this rock, now serving as his shelter wall. The stone was cool to the touch even in summer heat, demonstrating the thermal stability he was counting on. The side walls needed more attention. Where rock gave way to compacted soil, he needed to prevent crumbling and create surfaces that would not shed dirt into his living space. He mixed clay from the creek bank with water and small stones, creating a primitive plaster. He applied this mixture to the soil sections of the side walls, building up a layer several inches thick that bound the soil and created a relatively smooth surface. The work was tedious and messy, but necessary. Once dried, the clay plaster hardened into a shell that stabilized the soil behind it. Understanding the ground temperature principle became visceral as summer progressed. Surface temperatures during August days reached into the 80s, occasionally higher. Inside the excavation, the temperature never rose above 55 degrees. At night, when surface temperatures dropped into the 40s, the chamber temperature remained unchanged. This consistency confirmed what Lars had learned from his father and grandmother. Below a depth of several feet, Earth maintained stable temperature regardless of surface fluctuations. The chamber was surrounded by thermal mass that resisted temperature change. Lars conducted a simple experiment to understand the heating dynamics. He built a small fire near the chamber entrance and let it burn for several hours. The heat radiated into the space, warming the air and the rock walls. After the fire died, he monitored the temperature using his hand against the rear wall. The rock remained noticeably warm for more than 12 hours after the fire had ceased, slowly releasing the heat it had absorbed. This was the principle that would keep him alive through winter. A modest fire morning and evening would charge the thermal mass, which would release warmth steadily throughout the day and night. He also observed moisture behavior. Despite heavy rain during late August, no water penetrated the chamber. The rock was impermeable. The soil above the excavation absorbed rainfall, but the chamber roof remained dry. September brought the critical phase of construction. Lars needed to build a roof structure capable of supporting tons of earth while spanning 12 feet without central support posts. This was engineering beyond anything he had attempted before, but his father's mining experience provided essential knowledge. Mine tunnels used timber frameworks to prevent collapse, distributing the weight of overburden across multiple structural members. Lars had spent late summer selecting and preparing timber. He needed straight, strong logs, free from rot or significant defects. He chose lodgepole pine for the main support beams, felling trees that were 12 to 14 inches in diameter. He cut these to 14-foot lengths, allowing overhang beyond the chamber width. Each beam weighed several hundred pounds. Moving them from forest to building site required a sledge he constructed from smaller logs. Dragged by ropes, Lars pulled himself. The work took weeks. The structural design called for 6 primary beams spanning the chamber width. These would rest at the rear on the bedrock, which Lars had shaped to create a level-bearing surface. At the front, they would rest on the log facade wall he would build. Across these primary beams, he would lay secondary timbers, running perpendicular, creating a grid that would distribute weight and support the layers above. Positioning the first primary beam was a technical challenge. The log weighed approximately 400 pounds and needed to be lifted and placed precisely. Lars built a temporary ramp from earth and stones, extending from ground level to the height of the chamber rear wall. He rolled the beam up this ramp using wooden levers, inch by careful inch. The process took an entire day. When the beam finally rested in position, spanning from rear wall to where the front wall would be, Lars felt a surge of accomplishment disproportionate to the simple act of placing a log. The remaining 5 primary beams followed the same process over the next week. He spaced them evenly across the chamber width, roughly 2 feet apart. With all 6 in place, the roof structure began to look real rather than theoretical. The beams created a massive framework capable of bearing substantial weight. Secondary timbers came next. These were smaller, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, cut to 12-foot lengths. Lars laid them perpendicular to the primary beams, spacing them 12 inches apart. He notched each secondary timber where it crossed a primary beam, creating interlocking joints that prevented shifting. The notching was tedious work, requiring careful measurement and cutting with his axe and draw knife, but the result was a grid of timbers locked together into a unified structure. He tested the framework by loading it with stones, gradually adding weight to verify it would not sag or fail. The structure held firm. The primary beams distributed load to the rear bedrock and front wall supports. The secondary timbers prevented any individual beam from bearing concentrated weight. Lars calculated roughly that his framework could support at least 20 tons, far exceeding the weight of earth and sod he planned to pile on top. The facade represented the only portion of Lars's dwelling that would be exposed to weather and wind. While the rest of the structure drew strength from being buried in earth, this front wall needed to function as a traditional cabin wall while also supporting the massive roof framework. Lars approached its construction with the same methodical care he had applied to every other element. He selected logs with exceptional straightness and uniform diameter, rejecting any timber with significant taper or irregularity. Each log was approximately 10 inches thick, cut to 14-foot lengths to span the chamber width with extension beyond the edges. He stripped the bark completely using his draw knife, creating smooth surfaces that would fit together with minimal gaps. This bark removal alone consumed a full week of labor, but Lars understood that irregular bark would create voids that leaked heat. The foundation for the front wall was critical. Lars dug a trench along the front edge of his excavation, extending below the frost line. He filled this trench with stones fitted tightly together, creating a stable base that would not shift with freezing and thawing cycles. On this stone foundation, he laid his first log, checking it obsessively for level using a simple water-filled trough he had constructed as a leveling tool. Successive logs rose in courses, each one fitted carefully to the log below. Lars used a technique he had observed in Norwegian stabber construction, where buildings were assembled using carefully shaped timber that interlocked without notches. He planed the top surface of each log slightly concave and the bottom surface slightly convex, creating contact points that shed water while fitting tightly. Between each course, he applied his clay and pine resin mixture, the same compound he had developed for interior wall surfacing. The wall rose slowly. Unlike the rapid construction of notched log cabins, Lars's method required shaping each log individually to ensure proper fit. Some days he managed only a single course, but the result was a wall of exceptional tightness. When he held a candle near the joints, the flame did not flicker from drafts. The clay mixture, reinforced with horsehair he had collected from wild horses in the area, sealed every potential gap. At a height of 7 feet, Lars left openings for the door and window. The door opening measured 3 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall, positioned off-center to allow maximum wall space for structural integrity. The window opening was much smaller, only 12 inches square, positioned high on the wall near the roofline. Both openings were framed with heavy timber that extended through the wall thickness, creating rigid boxes that would not shift or compress. The top course of the facade wall sat precisely level with the front edge of his roof framework. Lars had calculated this alignment carefully during excavation, ensuring the primary roof beams would rest firmly on the completed wall. He secured the beams to the top logs using wooden pegs driven through drilled holes, locking the roof structure to the wall in a unified assembly that distributed forces throughout the entire front facade. With the timber framework and front wall complete, Lars faced the challenge of converting his structural grid into a weatherproof roof capable of supporting earth. The engineering required multiple layers, each serving specific functions. Strength, waterproofing, insulation, and drainage all needed to work together in a system that would last for years without maintenance access from above once buried. The first layer consisted of split planks laid across the secondary timbers. Lars had spent late September splitting straight-grained pine into boards roughly 2 inches thick and 10 inches wide. He laid these planks tightly together, covering the entire timber grid without gaps. Each plank was secured to the timbers beneath with wooden pegs. The planking created a solid deck that would support everything above while preventing soil from sifting through the framework. Waterproofing came next. Lars had observed that water infiltration would be his greatest enemy. Even small amounts of moisture penetrating the roof would saturate the earth layers, creating weight that could exceed his structural capacity while making the interior damp and unhealthy. He approached waterproofing with multiple redundant barriers rather than relying on any single method. His first barrier was birch bark. He had harvested large sections of bark from dead birch trees during summer, storing them flat under weights to prevent curling. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and durable. He laid sheets of bark across the planking in overlapping courses like shingles, starting at the front edge and working toward the rear. Each course overlapped the previous by 6 inches, ensuring water flowing downward would always encounter bark rather than gaps. He secured the bark with small wooden pegs driven through into the planking. Over the birch bark, Lars applied a thick layer of his clay mixture. He had prepared several hundred pounds of this compound, mixing clay from the creek bank with pine resin he had boiled down from sap collected throughout summer. The resin made the clay waterproof and adhesive. He spread this mixture over the entire bark surface, building up a layer roughly 1 inch thick. The work required careful attention to maintain consistent thickness and eliminate air pockets that could allow water channels to form. While the clay layer was still pliable, Lars pressed a final barrier into it. He had woven mats from willow branches, creating flexible sheets roughly 3 feet square. He laid these mats across the wet clay, pressing them firmly into the compound so the clay oozed through the gaps in the weaving. This created a reinforced waterproof membrane where clay, resin, and woven fiber formed a composite material stronger than any single component. The waterproofing layers dried and cured for 2 weeks while Lars worked on other tasks. When he tested the system by pouring buckets of water on the surface, the liquid ran off without penetrating. No moisture appeared on the plank ceiling inside the chamber. The multiple barriers had created genuine waterproofing. October brought the final roofing phase. Lars needed to pile earth on his waterproofed surface, creating the insulating and protective layer that would harness thermal mass while blending his dwelling into the natural hillside. But simply dumping soil would create problems. Erosion would wash earth away during heavy rain. Uncontrolled soil depth might exceed his structural capacity, and raw dirt would not support vegetation that could stabilize the surface and provide additional insulation. Lars developed a systematic approach based on his grandmother's turf house in Norway. He began with a drainage layer. He spread gravel 6 inches deep across the entire waterproof surface, creating a permeable zone where water could move horizontally toward the edges rather than pooling on the membrane below. The gravel came from the creek, hauled in leather bags Lars had sewn from deer hide. Moving several tons of gravel required 3 weeks of daily trips between creek and construction site. Over the gravel, he laid sod blocks cut from the hillside. He had spent late September cutting these blocks with his shovel, creating pieces roughly 12 inches square and 4 inches thick. Each block included grass, roots, and compacted soil. He laid them grass side up, fitting them tightly together like puzzle pieces. The living grass would continue growing, its roots binding the blocks together while the soil provided insulation. The sod layer added another 4 inches of depth. On top of the sod, Lars spread loose soil excavated from his original chamber digging. He had saved this material specifically for roof coverage. He built up the soil layer gradually, checking his roof structure for any signs of sagging or stress. The timber framework showed no deflection, even as he added tons of earth. He shaped the soil into a dome that was thickest at the center and tapered toward the edges, creating a surface where rainwater would naturally run off rather than pooling. The final soil depth measured 18 inches at the center, tapering to 12 inches near the edges. Combined with the sod, gravel, waterproofing, and planking, the total roof thickness exceeded 2 feet. Lars calculated the weight at approximately 15 tons distributed across his framework. The structure bore this load without complaint. The living sod established quickly. Autumn rains encouraged the grass to root deeply into the soil layer beneath. Within weeks, the roof was covered in growing vegetation that made the dwelling nearly invisible from above. A person standing on the hillside 20 feet away would see what appeared to be natural terrain, slightly raised but unremarkable. Only the exposed log facade revealed human construction. Lars observed how the thick earth layer affected interior temperature. As October air cooled into the 40s and 50s, the chamber temperature remained in the low 50s, warmed slightly by residual summer heat stored in the surrounding rock and earth. The massive roof insulation prevented interior warmth from escaping upward. Ventilating smoke through 2 feet of earth and sod presented challenges unlike anything Lars had encountered in standard cabin construction. A conventional chimney simply extended upward from a fireplace, relying on draft to pull smoke out. But Lars's chimney needed to penetrate multiple roof layers, maintain draft despite the length required to reach surface level, and prevent rain or snow from entering while allowing smoke to exit. He began by positioning his fireplace in the rear corner of the chamber, built against the bedrock wall. The location was strategic. Placing the fireplace at the deepest point of the dwelling meant smoke had the shortest possible path to exit, rising toward the higher front edge of the roof. The rear corner position also kept the fire away from the door and window, reducing drafts that might blow smoke into the living space. The fireplace itself was simple but well constructed. Lars built it from flat stones gathered from the creek, fitted together with clay mortar. The firebox was small, only 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, sized for efficiency rather than large fires. Above the firebox, he built a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge that prevented downdrafts from blowing smoke back into the room while deflecting heat forward into the chamber. This smoke shelf was a feature he remembered from his grandmother's house, and it proved essential for proper draft. From the smoke shelf, Lars constructed a chimney that angled forward and upward, following the slope of his roof. Standard chimneys ran vertically, but vertical construction through his layered roof would have required a straight shaft that penetrated all layers at once, creating potential leak points and structural weaknesses. An angled chimney could follow the roof slope, emerging at the front edge where the roof met the facade wall. He built the angled portion from stones fitted into a rectangular shaft roughly 8 inches square. Each stone was carefully selected and shaped to create smooth interior surfaces that would not obstruct smoke flow. He mortared the stones with clay, then lined the entire interior with additional clay that he smoothed and allowed to harden. The smooth lining reduced friction that might impede draft. The chimney penetrated his roof layers at an angle of approximately 30 degrees, emerging through the sod and earth at the front roof edge. Lars built a stone collar around the exit point, creating a raised lip that prevented rain from running down the exterior chimney surface into the roof layers. He capped the chimney exit with a flat stone supported on smaller stones, creating a cover that kept out rain while allowing smoke to escape from the sides. Testing the chimney required lighting a fire and observing smoke behavior. Lars built a small fire in his new fireplace, feeding it dry kindling. Smoke rose from the flames, hit the smoke shelf, and followed the angled chimney path upward. Within minutes, smoke was exiting the chimney top, pulled by draft created by temperature difference between the fire and exterior air. The skeptics who had mocked Lars's plan focused primarily on water infiltration. Thomas Caldwell had insisted repeatedly that any structure built into a hillside would flood during heavy rain, that moisture would seep through walls and ceiling, that the dwelling would become a damp cave unsuitable for human habitation. These concerns were legitimate and required systematic solutions that went beyond simple waterproofing. Lars addressed drainage through multiple interconnected systems. The first involved the site itself. His south-facing slope naturally shed water downward and away from the excavation. Rain falling on the hillside above his dwelling flowed around rather than toward the chamber. But he enhanced this natural drainage by creating channels. He dug shallow trenches in a V pattern above and to the sides of his structure, directing water flow away from the area directly over his roof. These drainage channels were lined with stones to prevent erosion and positioned to intercept water before it could saturate the soil above his dwelling. During heavy rain, the channels carried runoff downhill along paths that bypassed his construction entirely. The system was simple but effective, based on principles Lars had observed in Norwegian mountain farms, where hillside buildings survived centuries of harsh weather. Foundation drainage required different approach. Although his chamber was surrounded by rock on three sides, the front wall sat on soil foundation that could potentially wick moisture upward into the log structure. Lars had addressed this during foundation construction by creating a gravel barrier beneath the first course of logs. This gravel layer broke capillary action that would otherwise draw ground moisture into the wood. He had also angled the foundation slightly downward toward the exterior, ensuring any water reaching the gravel would flow outward rather than pooling beneath the wall. Interior moisture control involved maintaining proper vapor barriers and ventilation. The clay plaster he had applied to the side walls created an impermeable surface that prevented moisture from the surrounding earth from entering the living space. The rear bedrock wall was naturally impermeable. The only potential moisture source was interior air condensing on cool surfaces. Lars prevented condensation through ventilation design. In addition to his chimney, he created small air vents near the floor on either side of the door frame. These vents were only 2 inches in diameter, covered with wooden plugs he could remove or insert as needed. When opened, the vents allowed fresh air to enter near the floor level, while warm air exited through the chimney, creating circulation that prevented stagnant, humid air from accumulating. He tested his moisture control systems during October rains. Several storms brought heavy precipitation that would have revealed any weakness in his design. Lars monitored every surface inside the chamber during and after these rains. The walls remained dry. The ceiling showed no signs of moisture penetration. The floor did not become damp. His multi-layered approach to water management was successful. The temperature stability during rain was remarkable. Outside temperatures dropped when storms moved through, but chamber temperature remained unchanged. The thermal mass surrounding the space was so large that weather events could not affect it over the short term. November arrived with the first hard freezes, and Lars focused on completing the elements that would make his earth-sheltered dwelling fully functional. The door required strength, insulation, and security. He constructed it from planks hewn from a single large pine, selecting the densest wood he could find. Each plank was 3 inches thick. Fitted together using tongue and groove joints, he cut laboriously with his draw knife and chisel. The assembled door measured 3 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall, weighing approximately 80 pounds. Lars reinforced it with diagonal bracing on the interior face, heavy pine strips bolted through the planks with wooden pegs. The door was thick enough to provide substantial insulation, while strong enough to withstand any force the wilderness might apply. He hung it on iron hinges he had purchased in street Louis the previous year, massive pieces that he mortised into both the door and the door frame, creating connections that could not be torn free. The locking mechanism was simple but effective. A heavy wooden bar dropped into iron brackets mounted on the interior wall, barring the door closed from inside. From outside, Lars could operate the lock through a small slot cut near the handle, but only if he knew the mechanism's exact location and operation. The system provided security while allowing him to lock up when leaving for his trap lines. The window presented different challenges. Its 12-inch square opening, positioned high on the front wall near the ceiling, needed to admit light while maintaining security and insulation. Lars created a shutter from thick planks reinforced with iron brackets hinged to open inward. Behind the shutter, he stretched oiled canvas across the opening, creating a translucent covering that allowed diffused light to enter even when the shutter was open. The canvas was tough enough to resist tearing, but flexible enough to install without rigid framing. Interior furnishings were minimal but carefully constructed. Lars built a sleeping platform along one side wall, raised 2 feet above the floor to provide storage beneath and keep him off the cold ground. The platform was wide enough for comfort, framed with heavy timber and topped with pine planks that supported a mattress he had sewn from deer hide and stuffed with dried grass. He constructed a small table using the same careful joinery he had employed throughout the dwelling, creating a surface that was level and sturdy. Shelves mounted high on the walls provided storage for food supplies, tools, and equipment. Each shelf was braced with wooden brackets and capable of bearing substantial weight. He built a bench near the fireplace where he could sit while working on equipment or simply warming himself. The fireplace received final attention. Lars shaped a hearthstone from a flat piece of granite he had found in the creek, fitting it precisely in front of the firebox. He built a simple crane from iron rod, allowing him to suspend pots over the fire for cooking. The entire fireplace system was designed for efficiency rather than appearance, sized to heat the space without consuming excessive fuel. December 1838 brought temperatures that plunged below zero and stayed there for days. Lars had moved into his completed earth-sheltered dwelling in early December, bringing his supplies, furs, and equipment from the temporary shelter where he had lived during construction. The structure had cost him 7 months of continuous labor, from May excavation through November finishing work. Now it would prove whether that investment had been justified or wasted. The first serious cold arrived suddenly. Morning temperatures that had hovered near 20 degrees dropped to 5 below overnight, then continued falling. By the third day of the cold snap, Lars's thermometer registered -18 degrees. Wind swept down from the mountains, driving the cold deeper. This was weather that killed unprepared men and tested even the best shelters. Inside his dwelling, Lars experienced conditions unlike anything he had known in previous winters. He built a small fire in his fireplace each morning and evening, using roughly 1/10 the firewood he would have consumed in a standard cabin. The fire was modest, barely more than cooking fire size, yet within an hour of lighting it, the chamber temperature rose to the mid-40s. More remarkably, the temperature remained stable for 12 to 15 hours after the fire died. The principle Lars had counted on was working exactly as he had hoped. The fire heated the air in the chamber, which in turn warmed the surrounding rock and earth. These massive thermal masses absorbed heat during the few hours the fire burned, then released it gradually throughout the day and night. The chamber was surrounded by thousands of tons of material that resisted temperature change, creating a thermal battery that smoothed out the dramatic swings of exterior conditions. Lars monitored the phenomenon carefully, placing his hand against the rear bedrock wall at different times. Hours after the morning fire had burned down to ash, the rock remained noticeably warm to the touch. By evening, it had cooled slightly, but still held substantial heat. The evening fire recharged this thermal mass, repeating the cycle. The system required only enough fuel to raise the chamber temperature a few degrees twice daily, rather than fighting constantly against heat loss as traditional cabins did. His firewood consumption was stunningly low. A single day's supply of wood in a standard cabin lasted him nearly a week. He spent perhaps 2 hours every 5 days cutting and hauling fuel, compared to the 4 or 5 hours daily that trappers in conventional shelters invested. The time savings allowed him to focus on trap lines, hunting, and equipment maintenance. The comfort level exceeded his expectations. He wore normal indoor clothing, not the multiple layers required to survive inside poorly heated cabins. He could work at his table without his fingers going numb. He slept under moderate blankets rather than piling on every fur he owned. The dwelling maintained livable conditions with minimal effort. Word of Lars's survival through the severe cold reached other trappers through the informal communication network that connected isolated camps. Men traveling between trap lines brought news that the Norwegian was living comfortably in his hillside dwelling, burning almost no wood while temperatures outside remained brutally low. The reports were met with skepticism and curiosity in equal measure. Samuel Garrett decided to investigate personally. The old Virginia trapper had spent 15 winters in the mountains and had seen enough men die from cold to respect any technique that improved survival odds. He arrived at Lars's site on a January morning when the temperature read -22 degrees. He brought with him 2 thermometers, crude but functional instruments he had acquired from a surveying expedition years earlier. Lars welcomed him and demonstrated his dwelling's performance. Garrett placed 1 thermometer outside, sheltered from direct wind but exposed to ambient air. The reading stabilized at -22 degrees. He placed the second thermometer inside the chamber, away from the fireplace, but in a central location. The interior reading showed 49 degrees. Lars's morning fire had died hours earlier, yet the chamber maintained temperature 71 degrees warmer than the exterior. Garrett spent the day observing and measuring. He examined the construction details, asking questions about excavation depth, roof structure, waterproofing methods, and thermal mass principles. Lars explained his reasoning and techniques without reservation, walking Garrett through each design decision. The older trapper was particularly interested in the chimney design and the drainage systems, recognizing these as potential failure points that Lars had solved successfully. In late afternoon, as exterior temperature remained in the -20s, Lars built his evening fire. Garrett watched as a modest blaze of perhaps 6 small logs warmed the chamber from 49 degrees to 54 degrees over the course of 2 hours. When the fire died down, Garrett continued monitoring. The chamber temperature dropped only 1 degree in the next 4 hours to 53 degrees, while exterior temperature fell further to -26 degrees. The measurements were unambiguous. Lars's earth-sheltered dwelling maintained interior temperature approximately 70 degrees warmer than exterior conditions using minimal fuel. A standard cabin under the same conditions would struggle to maintain a 20 to 30 degree differential even with fires burning constantly. The efficiency advantage was roughly 3 to 1 in terms of temperature maintenance and perhaps 10 to 1 in terms of fuel consumption. Garrett asked permission to bring other trappers to see the dwelling. Lars agreed. Over the next 2 weeks, small groups visited. Thomas Caldwell came, still skeptical but unable to deny the thermometer readings and the tiny woodpile that sustained Lars through weather that had other trappers burning entire trees daily. Peter Morrison arrived with frost-damaged fingers, legacy of a night when his cabin fire had gone out and he had awakened to interior temperatures below zero. Late February brought an encounter that validated Lars's design in ways beyond thermal efficiency. A large grizzly, likely a male based on track size, emerged from hibernation early and began ranging through the area, searching for food. The bear had denned somewhere in the surrounding hills and was following its normal spring pattern of investigating any potential food sources. Lars's dwelling, built into a hillside and covered with earth and sod, appeared to the bear as natural terrain rather than human construction. Lars first noticed the tracks on a morning when he emerged to check his nearby trap lines. Fresh prints in the snow showed the bear had passed within 10 feet of his dwelling's entrance during the night, circled the area, and moved on. The animal had apparently investigated the scent of smoke from his chimney, but found nothing that resembled the vulnerable cabins bears had learned to associate with easy food access. The bear returned 3 days later while Lars was inside preparing pelts. He heard heavy footsteps above and slightly behind his position, directly over the chamber roof. The bear was walking on top of his dwelling, its weight distributed across the thick earth layer. Inside, Lars heard only muffled sounds. The roof structure did not flex or creak. The tons of earth between him and the animal absorbed all stress from the bear's movement. Through his small window, Lars watched the grizzly descend from the roof area and approach the front facade. The bear sniffed at the door, testing it with one paw. The heavy construction did not budge. Unlike standard cabin doors that bears had learned to force open, Lars's door was effectively part of the wall structure, impossible to breach without destroying the entire facade. The bear examined the opening briefly, then lost interest and wandered away. The incident stood in sharp contrast to Peter Morrison's experience 2 weeks earlier. Morrison's conventional cabin, located 8 miles south, had been attacked by what was likely the same bear. The animal had torn the door from its leather hinges, destroyed Morrison's winter supply of dried meat, and shredded his bedding before leaving. Morrison had been on his trap lines during the attack, but returned to find his shelter compromised and most of his food gone. He had survived the remainder of winter only by relocating to a temporary camp near another trapper. Morrison visited Lars in early March, asking for help rebuilding using earth-sheltered design. The Scottish trapper had lost 3 toes to frostbite in his standard cabin during January and had nearly lost his food supplies to the bear in February. He was convinced that conventional methods were inadequate for mountain survival. Lars agreed to assist, and they spent April and May excavating a new chamber in a hillside near Morrison's trap lines. Johann Weber arrived in late March with similar requests. The German trapper had survived winter, but had exhausted himself maintaining fires and cutting wood. He had calculated his fuel consumption and realized he had burned nearly 40 cords of wood between November and March, representing hundreds of hours of labor that could have been invested in trapping. He wanted to build an earth-sheltered dwelling before the next winter. The technique spread through the northern Rocky Mountain trapping community over the following 5 years, not through promotion or formal instruction, but through the simple reality that men who adopted earth-sheltered construction survived more comfortably and efficiently than those who clung to conventional methods. By 1843, at least 15 earth-sheltered dwellings existed across the Montana and Wyoming territories, each one a variation on the principles Lars had developed. The specific designs varied based on available materials, individual skill levels, and site conditions. Some trappers built smaller chambers than Lars's original. Others expanded the concept, creating structures with multiple rooms. A few combined earth sheltering with partial above-ground construction, using the hillside for thermal mass while maintaining more window area for light. But all shared the core principles of excavation into stable soil or rock, heavy timber framework to support earth roofing, careful waterproofing, and minimal exposure of facade to exterior conditions. The name that stuck in frontier vernacular was simply rock cabins, though the structures were as much earth as stone. Trappers would tell newcomers to build a rock cabin if they wanted to survive Montana winters without becoming a slave to the woodpile. The phrase carried respect rather than mockery, signifying construction that worked with natural principles rather than fighting against them. Lars himself continued trapping until 1844, when the collapse of beaver markets made the profession unsustainable. He had saved money during his years in the mountains, living frugally and investing profits rather than spending them on whiskey and gambling like many trappers. He left the mountains in spring of 1844 and traveled to the Oregon Territory, where he purchased land and established a small farm. He married in 1846 a widow named Marie Bergman, who had emigrated from Germany with her late husband. They had 3 children over the following years. Lars never returned to the mountains, and he rarely spoke of his trapping years. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a farmer who worked his land with the same methodical care he had applied to everything in his life. Lars Eriksson died in 1873, at age 64, of pneumonia, following a winter illness. He was buried in a cemetery outside Portland. His gravestone recorded his name, birth year, death year, and the simple phrase, "beloved husband and father." Nothing mentioned his years in the wilderness or the innovation he had developed. But in the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, his dwellings remained. Some were still occupied by trappers, hunters, or prospectors who discovered them and recognized their superior construction. Others stood empty but intact, their earth-covered roofs blending into hillsides, their chambers dry and stable decades after construction. A few had been found and expanded by homesteaders, who added to the original structures while preserving the core earth-sheltered design. Modern estimates suggest the technique saved at least 30 lives over the following decades, though the exact number cannot be determined. Men survived winters that would have killed them in conventional shelters. They avoided bear attacks that destroyed standard cabins. They conserved strength and resources for productive work rather than exhausting themselves, maintaining inadequate heating systems. The innovation persisted because it solved real problems through sound engineering rather than tradition or assumption.